By late December 1884, William Dickinson was a seasoned lighthouse keeper at the Long Point Cut Lighthouse on the north shore of Lake Erie in Ontario, Canada. In December on Lake Erie, it's rare, although not unheard of, to see a ship passing in the night as the lake typically freezes, locks are shut down, and ships go into dry dock for repairs and upgrades. That frigid December morning, William sat by his fireplace in the lightkeeper's residence, scanning the icy cold waters of Lake Erie. As expected, there was nothing of note to see. That is, until William saw something very unusual. It was a large, black object bobbing up and down in the waves, slowly making its way to shore. The dutiful lightkeeper threw on his hat and coat and made his way out to the beach, and there he realized what the black object was. It was a body. From the south shore of Lake Erie, this is Great Lakes True Crime. Long Point is a 25-mile or 40-kilometer-long sand spit that juts out from mainland Ontario in a southerly direction into Lake Erie. It's basically across the lake from Erie, Pennsylvania, for those of you familiar with the area. The point was formed by sand collecting on a glacial moraine at the bottom of Lake Erie, deposited around 12,000 years ago by the Wisconsin Glacier. In the mid-1800s, a natural channel began to form through the sand spit as a result of several strong northeast storms. The channel provided a navigational path for smaller vessels to travel along the northern area of Lake Erie without having to navigate all the way around the 25-mile sand spit. This channel became known as the Long Point Cut, and it was determined by the Canadian Parliament that a lighthouse should be constructed to assist with navigation through the cut. Hence, the Long Point Cut Lighthouse was born in October 1879. The lighthouse is 60 feet high and had a visible lantern of up to 12 miles on a clear night. Without going down too much of a rabbit hole here, it should be noted that being a lighthouse keeper on the Great Lakes in the 1800s was often a very lonely existence, particularly in the winter months. In many cases, the only people a lightkeeper would see on a regular basis, if anyone, was his wife and kids, if they had any. And often, when a male lightkeeper would die, his wife would assume the lonely, difficult job without him. The Long Cut lightkeeper job was no exception to this loneliness. In fact, if the Long Cut keeper wanted to see another human, he would have to row a boat to the town of Port Rowan, which was close to 4 miles or over 6 kilometers away, in a rowboat. Eventually, the Long Point Cut was filled in by the same forces of nature that opened it up. The lighthouse was decommissioned in 1916, but it still stands today. It's a private residence now. Now, back to that late December day in 1884. After finding that the dark object he saw was a body, William initially assumed it may have been a sailor that had been lost at sea or perhaps died on board and was buried at sea. He eventually grabbed the man's shirt and dragged the body to shore, pulling it far enough inwards so the waves wouldn't carry it back out. When William took a good look at the remains, he was astounded by what he found. First, the man's face was not one that he recognized, and there was no identifying information on the man. More surprisingly, all 4 of the limbs were tied up. He then noticed that the man's face was partially caved in, as if having been bashed by a heavy, blunt object. The lightkeeper surmised that this young man had been brutally murdered rather than having succumbed to an accident. It truly saddened William to see a young man's life cut short like this. The next day, William decided to give the deceased man a proper burial, at least as proper as he could manage on a desolate sand spit in the dead of winter. He dragged the body even further inland and placed it in a crude box that he had fashioned. He buried the man toward the center of the peninsula, further away from the water and waves. After saying a prayer, he covered the body with sand and rocks and marked the grave with a large wooden board. Next, he contacted the Norfolk County authorities and alerted them to what had happened. He provided the best description he could, and the county officials said they would forward the details on to local newspapers in hopes that the man's identity could be established. William waited for any news about the man's identity as he tended to his lightkeeper duties over the next few days, which turned into weeks, and then into months without hearing anything, all the while being haunted by the grisly nature of the man's death. Finally, on March 10th, 1885, he heard some news. That morning, Ontario Detective John Murray paid a visit to the lighthouse, accompanied by a man named John Piggott from Bay City, Michigan. The two men advised William that John's brother, Marshall Piggott, had been missing since November 17th, when he was seen walking toward Lake Erie from his home in nearby Elgin County, Ontario, which was about 40 miles or 64 kilometers from the lighthouse. John had been looking for his brother ever since then. So the three men walked to the gravesite and exhumed the body by hand, digging away the cold sand and stones. They found that the body was so badly decomposed after 3 months that a visual identity could not be established by looking at the face. However, John ran his fingers along the man's torso and felt what he feared he would find. It was a protrusion from the man's clavicle area, and John's brother Marshall had such a feature. It was from a congenital condition commonly known as pigeon chest, where an interaction of cartilage with the ribs causes a person's breastbone to protrude outward. The technical term for this condition is pectus carinatum. Aside from the protrusion in the chest area, John also recognized the boots as those of his brother. They had originally been his own boots, but he later gave them to Marshall. On top of these two details, John removed the boots and identified a deformed toe that his brother had since birth. There was no doubt this was the body of Marshall Piggott. With the question of who now being answered, the next questions were how and why. The remains of Marshall were transported to nearby Elgin County, where Marshall had lived, and Detective Murray began an investigation into this likely homicide. Murray learned that Marshall was 29 years old at the time of his death, and he owned a 50-acre farm that he inherited from his father. Marshall lived there with his wife, Sarah Beecham, who was the daughter of another local farmer. The pair married in 1881, and in 1883 they had a son, also named Marshall. At first glance, it would seem that the family should have a happy, fulfilling life on the farm, but Detective Murray learned that Marshall had been relentlessly teased and bullied because of his physical deformity and a slow manner of speaking. He had been described by some as simple and slow-minded. He trusted everyone he met, and unfortunately, a number of people took advantage of him. After his wedding to Sarah, the family was hopeful that she would keep an eye out for unscrupulous people like these. Sadly, however, not long after little baby Marshall was born, Sarah died from a mystery illness characterized by intense retching and vomiting. Detective Murray approached his supervisor with the information he had come across and asked for permission to conduct a formal investigation into Marshall's death. The approval was granted, and the body was taken to the coroner for an autopsy to be conducted. Murray set out to interview family, friends, and neighbors of Marshall, with his first visit being to John and Marshall Piggott's mother, Lavina, who lived nearby. Lavina had some interesting information to share with Detective Murray. She recalled that a few days after Marshall disappeared, she has a visitor to her house. The visitor, named Havelock Smith, claimed that Lavina's son Marshall had borrowed $1,300 from her, and he was hoping she could front the money until Marshall could pay her back. This was a large sum of money, about $55,000 in today's money. She was immediately suspicious, and Detective Murray followed up on this to find out more information. He learned that Havelock Smith lived on a neighboring farm with his mother. At 28 years old, Smith was a year younger than Marshall and by all accounts had been an upstanding member of the community. Some said, however, that he started acting rather odd around the time of Marshall's disappearance. By one account, Havelock had rented a rowboat that mid-November in nearby Port Bruce to supposedly retrieve some fishing nets he had in the nearshore area of Lake Erie. He rented the boat alone and went out alone and didn't tell his mother or his brother that he was going out, all of which was very unusual. He was said to have always gone fishing with his brother. The man who rented the rowboat to Havelock in Port Bruce said that mid-November was a highly unusual time to retrieve fishing nets. They were typically brought in much earlier in the autumn, so a number of details related to this boat rental seemed peculiar, including the fact that he was only supposed to have the boat for a few days, but didn't return it for more than 3 weeks. In further looking into this story, Detective Murray determined that Havelock never lent the $1,300 to Marshall, as he never had access to that much money. In fact, Marshall's farm was valued at about $1,300 at the time, and it was said to have been a prime farming location with very fertile soil and direct access to Lake Erie. The farm was so highly coveted locally, in fact, that a rumor spread that when Marshall's wife Sarah died from a mystery illness, it was thought that perhaps someone poisoned Sarah, and that would clear the way for the person to more easily manipulate Marshall into selling them the farm. As the murder investigation continued, Detective Murray learned that Havelock had been seen at Marshall's farm on the morning of November 17, 1884. The two men were seen that morning walking together from Marshall's farm to Havelock's farm. That is the last time anyone recalled seeing Marshall Piggott. Later that afternoon, witnesses saw Marshall walking without Havelock and with his pants soaking wet, and carrying a shotgun. His explanation for the gun was that he was chasing a fox on his property, but there was no reason given for the wet pants. With all this information being uncovered through his investigation, Detective Murray was convinced that Havelock Smith murdered Marshall Piggott, and he felt that he had enough evidence to back it up. So Havelock was arrested on March 24, 1885, on a charge of premeditated murder. He was locked up in the nearby St. Thomas jail. The murder trial of Havelock Smith began on November 24, 1885, just over a year after Marshall's death. The prosecution called 108 witnesses during the trial and theorized that Havelock lured Marshall to a secluded area, hit him over the head with a blunt object, and then rowed his body out into Lake Erie. He then weighed down the body in hopes that it would not be found. In the area of where the rowboat had been kept, authorities found a 100-pound metal bar that had gone missing from a neighboring property. For their part, the defense argued that the body was so badly decomposed that it was impossible to tell if it was even the remains of Marshall Piggott or someone maybe completely different. After closing arguments were made, the jury deliberated for a number of hours. They ultimately alerted the judge that they were deadlocked, and a mistrial was declared. The prosecutors did not give up, however. Havelock Smith was put on trial for a second time. The second trial had endured for 4 long months. In September 1886, the jury in the second trial advised the judge that they too were hopelessly deadlocked, with 7 of them voting for conviction and 5 voting for acquittal. After the second mistrial was declared, Havelock was released from jail and lived the rest of his life in freedom. No one else was ever tried for Marshall's murder, as police and prosecutors were certain that Havelock was guilty. Detective Murray advocated for a third trial, but that never materialized. In his memoirs written after his retirement, Murray wrote, quote, "My mind is undimmed by a doubt in this case," unquote. While justice was never served in the murder of Marshall Piggott, a silver lining to this case is that his body was identified and his remains returned to his family for a proper burial near his farm. William Dickinson stayed on as the Long Point Cut Lightkeeper until 1901. In total, he spent 12 years in that position. Havelock Smith stayed in the area after the 2 trials ended. And that's all for this case, but I did want to give you a quick streaming review. I caught the 6-part series Lies and Deceit on Netflix. It's a Spanish production that is a remake of an earlier British show called Liar, which I can't remember if I've seen or not. The basic premise is that a teacher goes on a date with a surgeon who is also the single father of one of her students. After the date, she asserts that the surgeon drugged and raped her, and the series follows her quest for justice. It's dubbed into English, but I watched it in the original Spanish language with English subtitles. And yes, I still turned up the volume when I couldn't hear it, even though I don't yet know how to speak Spanish. Anyway, I definitely recommend this one. That's Lies and Deceit on Netflix. And that's all for this episode of Great Lakes True Crime. You can follow the show on Facebook and Twitter. Just search for Great Lakes True Crime. You can also check out links in the show notes for our social media handles, the web address, and the show merchandise page. And many thanks to those who recently left 5-star reviews on their podcast app, including Ohio Water Lover. If you have not left a 5-star review, please take a minute to do so. Among the millions of podcasts out there, positive reviews help get the word out about the show. For Great Lakes True Crime, this has been Steve, your host and producer. Thanks for listening, guys.